Madam Chair, just before we start, in front of the sheet, that was the slide that was presented to you in the briefings and also at every public meeting. Now, I recognise you've had a lot of information to take in, and we didn't specifically focus just on New Brighton, but at least if I can just share that with you, and you can keep it as a reference to refer to when we go through the commercial chapter. That's correct. So that slide has been presented to you and at every public meeting to date. So I'll pass now to Mark to continue and hopefully finish the commercial revision shortly.
Just briefly on the diagram, the elevations on the top half show the existing city plan height limits, and the bottom half show the proposed height limits. To interpret it, you need also the table summarising the hierarchy and where centres fall in that hierarchy. But I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards about this, or now in more detail if you wish.
Did you point out where New Brighton is on it?
Oh, just for the purpose of clarity, New Brighton, as you're aware, has height limits of 30 metres and 20 metres in the current city plan, and based on its category as a neighbourhood centre, the height limits are 12 and 8 metres, but as I said earlier, we'll go out and consult on that matter, and that will be in conjunction with consultation on the extent of the zoned area of New Brighton Centre and other matters around scale.
So New Brighton features in the middle of, roughly in the middle of both of those diagrams.
Yep. The large neighbourhood and small neighbourhood are identical, so sorry, yeah.
On these lines, you'll see there are bars that relate to New Brighton. Yeah.
New Brighton as a large neighbourhood centre sits here relative to the central city at one end and small local parades of shops at the other. If I could go back to the chapter, just referring to the amendments that have been made, the next changes relate to Objective 1, and quite rightly, the title previously of that objective was Recovery of Commercial Activities and Centres, but it wasn't only about recovery, and a comment was made that recovery is the centres will go for a phase of recovery, but it's, we need to look beyond that. And so there's some changes I've made to the title of the objective to call it Focus of Commercial Activity, which is about where we focus that activity. Sorry, that's on page 3 of the chapter. And just in that, on that same theme, Objective 1, Clause D, I've added the words there in orange, so it reads, supports the recovery in the short to medium term and enhances vitality and the amenity of centres, to recognise that we want to enhance vitality and amenity regardless of timeframes, but recovery is seen as a short to medium term process. Turning to Policy 5, which is on page 6. One of the key issues raised was what's occurred at Aidenfield and Northwood.
Sorry, we're just doing the amendments to the commercial chapter and then we'll move on to the industrial chapter.
The Policy 5, which relates to local centres in Greenfield residential areas. As we've found in Aidenfield and Northwood, there's not been commercial centres developed in those locations, and so we've sought to reword the policy to strengthen it and state that those areas identified for commercial activities shall be developed and used for primarily commercial activity. The previously worded policy didn't go that far and only related to areas that weren't yet zoned. This policy now relates to both existing zoned areas as well as future greenfield areas that are yet to be rezoned. Moving on to Policy 8, which is on page 7. There was discussion about principles of environmentally sustainable design, and what I'm proposing to do is come to you on the workshop that's being held on urban design. For that forum, I'll circulate before then a paper summarising options in terms of rules to consider for green buildings. But in the interim, we've changed the wording of the clause 8, which did read reflecting principles of environmentally sustainable design, and changed it to incorporating principles of environmentally sustainable design to recognise that it should be incorporated in order to be well designed. So, welcome any feedback on that.
Just a question, if I may.
Yep.
Is there no mention of dealing with stormwater requirements, or is that somewhere else? Energy efficiency, water conservation, and sustainable methods of addressing stormwater.
Yeah, we can make that more explicit. It sits under the heading of water conservation.
Thank you.
But
It is part of design, though.
yeah, we can integrate something around that.
I think that would be quite good, because stormwater is a huge issue and a big impact on our infrastructure, and if we get the design right at the outset, it takes the stress off our systems, more environmental.
Now, sorry.
With the suburban master centre plans, it's still like, from what I read, it's like they're still dependent on something like a LERP or to actually have any real ability to enforce or require changes.
One of the handouts this morning is a paper, just two-sided page, which summarises the rules that come through and sit below the policy to give effect to those master plans, which give some teeth to the actions in the master plans that were identified as requiring implementation through the district plan. There's a whole range of other actions that are about public space improvements and other changes which don't come through in the district plan review, because obviously the district plan is just one tool, but the handout that you've got summarises the rules, which are the teeth, for want of a better term.
But you're quite right, the suburban centre master plans are visionary under the Local Government Act, they're not statutory plans. Where there are changes needed to zones or rules, that can be done through the district plan. Where there is money to be invested into these areas, that would have to be done through the annual plan process, and then there are other methods as well. So the suburban centre master plans themselves are not statutory.
And this process doesn't really
Well, it does, because it includes, as it shows on those 2 pages, the page dot, right? There are certain amendments to the plan that have been made to achieve what's requested in the suburban centre master plans. That's what's listed here on this page.
And it's just occurred to me that's not a comprehensive list. For instance, Littleton, the community there, sought the build up to the footpath of new buildings to retain that clean frontage, and that's a generic principle that applies to all centres, so it's not come through in that table, but there's other changes that have come about partly because of master plans. If I could just move on to some of the amendments that have been made to the rules, which reflects the feedback, and there's 5 points I wish to briefly cover. One of those was, you'll note there was in the earlier draft provision made for the breach of rules for, let's say, an office activity that wanted to locate at ground floor level rather than being required to locate above ground floor level. And an example given by Councillor Johansson was, or a concern raised was the potential for a bar to have adverse impacts if it's allowed to breach the standards in the plan. And in light of the discussion we had about the temporary becoming the permanent and the potential for adverse consequences of allowing for a temporary breach of the rules, we've since taken those provisions out of the draft because there's still a need for some assessment to be made and to ensure that if there is a breach of a standard, that we're comfortable that the effects can be addressed. So that temporary that breach of rules for a temporary period is essentially now absent from this chapter. The second point is exceptions for an urban design assessment. Now, sorry. I'll refer to the page numbers for these next bullet points, but these 5 bullet points sum up the amendments made to the chapter.
So the temporary stuff, like, you're removing the provision for the breach of rules, or you're putting them in?
I'm removing the ability to breach the rules
So
for
now,
a temporary period of time.
so the issue that we've legally given consent to a whole bunch of temporary activities is still valid?
They're still valid, and they'll expire in April 2016. But what the previous draft that you saw last week had a provision additional to that, which allowed for an activity that's permitted in the commercial centre. That provision I'd put forward in the draft allowed for a breach of the height standard. Breach of a standard that requires, for instance, officers to be above ground floor. And I've since removed that provision that enabled a temporary breach of standards because it could lead to perverse outcomes.
So, just so I'm clear, so like we basically, when we notify, we'll be telling people, the people that currently have got temporary consents, they will have to reapply before 2016 for a resource consent with the new district plan provisions.
That's right.
And there'll be no automatic granting of consents, or there'll be a public process to go through that weighs up the effects.
There'll be a consenting process to go through and a decision made for each of those consents as to whether it's notified or not.
And the underlying zoning of where those temporary activities are currently now, what will it be?
There's been, in the case of Cafe Metro, we've proposed a commercial zoning for that property given the permanence of that use, but that's an exception to the rule, and generally speaking the zoning doesn't change for those locations where there's a temporary consent on the basis that those temporary consents are only temporary, and unless resource consent's since been granted for a permanent use of that site for commercial activity, it's not appropriate in our view to preempt any consideration through the consent process.
So have we got a list of the exceptions?
You were given this morning this list of temporary activities, and there's also a memo to go with it from myself that gives a bit of a summary, and there's also a map to show where they all are. That was left on your desk this morning.
Just to put your mind at ease, Cafe Metro is the only site where we've changed the zoning in light of a resource consent being granted for a temporary activity on a permanent basis. Yeah.
Sorry, can you use your microphone, please?
I saw in the consent, sorry, I'm just struggling because we've got like so much paper. I found it. There was some quite significant changes. So, like for example, under 4, condition of consent, within 3 months of date of approval, consent holder should prepare and submit a management plan to council. That's to ensure the character and nature of boutique is maintained and future changes. So I don't know if that's happened or just been removed. There's been a restriction on the type of activities that could establish. Again, that seems to be removed. Signage shall be contained. That's going to be reviewed. There's car parking issues, landscaping issues. I don't. How much have the conditions that went with that consent being changed?
The conditions
on a sort of like scale of 100. 180 degree turnaround, or is it 15% or?
The conditions of the resource consent itself don't change as a consequence of these new rules, but the rules do enable development within the scope of what the commercial local zone provides for, which is broader than what the resource consent provides for. Having said that, the resource consent is there's a requirement to comply still with the resource consent conditions.
If the activity they want to do on the site is going to comply with the new plan,
Yep.
What I'd suspect they'd do is simply surrender the resource consent that they've got, and then their activity is a permitted activity under the plan.
If it does.
The alternative approach is that we continue to zone that land in question as residential, whilst recognising that a resource consent has been granted for a commercial activity which is likely to remain on a permanent basis and unlikely to return to residential use. That's a valid point, and we can go away and consider that further.
But currently, any consent would be assessed against the operative plan. So it's not assessed against these rules that we're looking at today.
Righto, carry on.
Just on exceptions for urban design assessment, just using, if I could refer you to page 9 of the chapter. There's text in orange on page 9, and there's a series of exceptions when a requirement for resource consent for an assessment of urban design is not required based on these exceptions. Firstly, where a new building or an addition to buildings not visible from a publicly accessible space, and publicly accessible space should be highlighted green because we've got a definition for that. Where the width of the site is less than 6 metres, excluding corner sites, or where the development's limited to repairs, maintenance, seismic, fire and or access building code upgrades. And that wording reflects what was coming through in a plan change led by council up until this district plan review commencing Plan Change 56, which was subject to a submissions process, and is to recognise that not all development should be subject to an urban design assessment if it's A, not visible to the general public, and B, if it's those other conditions there. In terms of the width of the site, it's obviously not, if it's a narrow site, then it's not going to have a significant bearing on the overall appearance of a frontage. So there's those exceptions introduced. Moving on to page 70, just using page 76 as an example. On that page there's just an example of where we've introduced a non-notification clause. So in this case, in East Belfast, which is a new commercial local centre proposed in a Greenfield residential area, we're introducing a clause that if there's a requirement, if there's a resource consent required on design grounds, that shouldn't be notified. There's not considered to be affected persons, and council wishes to make that assessment without the developer having to pay additional costs for notification or a hearing, and that's to address one of the issues that has been raised through consultation, that introducing urban design controls will have greater costs, and in this respect, by having a non-notification clause, it reduces the potential cost of a resource consent.